Red Westerns is a film genre popularized behind the Iron Curtain in the 1960s and 70s. Like flexibly accumulated Air Jordans, the films were designed in a metropole, but produced part by part throughout the world, in places such as Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Cuba, and various parts of the Soviet Union by the Red Circle Workers Group. The genre is, like Hollywood westerns, chock full of hallmarks such as railroading robber barons, ambush stagecoaches on the high plains, rock'em sock'em bar brawls, vengeful Indians assembled into war parties, and spellbinding man-to-man showdowns. These 12 DEFA studio productions made between 1965 and 1983, with titles such as The Sons of Great Mother Bear, Speer des Falken, Weißwolf, Apachen, Tecumseh, Chingachgook die Große Schlange, Osceola, Uzana, Blutsbruder, Severino, and Der Scout invert tropes common to Hollywood westerns by glorifying Native American struggle against avaricious white settlers. Red westerns self-consciously critique United States expansion in the American West as an expression of colonial greed and racism. The films thus ideologically invert Hollywood westerns by imposing a socialist notion of community onto the western genre. And they were ultimately designed to demythologize Manifest Destiny as an imperialist venture underwritten by the U.S. federal government in league with heartless capitalists who seem to delight in the displacement and genocide of Native Americans. Like Hollywood westerns, they pit good guys versus bad guys in a hollow, one-dimensional opposition. The Americans are not Indians, and Indians are not Americans is a recurring rendition in each Red Western. The genre is, as Gerd Germunten argues, an official critique of imperialism. The fate of North American Indians provided a showcase of what it means to be a victim of capitalist expansion, the consequences of which can range from unequal trade, theft, and deceit to willful starvation, random murder, and organized genocide. Native Americans depicted in Red Westerns are, despite the few corrupted by imperialist values and firewater, content members of a homogeneous society in which, like worker ants, everyone knows their role in the community. Leadership is determined by tribal laws, which are never questioned. Decisions are not made impulsively, but by careful deliberation of tribal leaders. Conflicts arise with white settlers, Union soldiers, planters, oilmen, and robber barons, but seldom within the community. And since these films were made by the state for popular consumption, they were ultimately designed to manufacture consent of the masses. A total of 12 Red Westerns were produced between 1965 and 1983. One film was generally distributed each summer while kids were on holiday from school. The Sons of Great Mother Bear was viewed 10 million times in Eastern Bloc theaters, making it and Red Westerns an important Cold War vehicle for delineating the continuities of an American imperial narrative. They are, in short, hot media in the midst of a global cold and culture war. In Dialectics of Enlightenment, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer theorized that there was distinct connections between the authoritarian nature of culture in interwar Germany and post-war America, particularly both culture cinema, which symbiotically and powerfully melds multiple mass communication mediums. Despite the ideological rhetoric, Red Westerns are part of a global culture industry rooted in fantasy and consumption that was pervasive throughout fascist Germany in the interwar era, as well as post-war America. Adorno and Horkheimer, however, overlooked the triangulation of popular culture in post-war America with East and West Germany, as well as interwar fascism. Red Westerns, like commercials, are designed to manipulate viewers into docility and passivity. Despite the anti-authoritarian ideology espoused, the process of consumption is as unidirectional as listening to the radio. In short, Red Westerns, like commercials, did not permit viewers to be subjects, but rather passive receptacles of information, mere objects exposed in authoritarian fashion to the same programs put out by different stations. and DEFA used the movies as propaganda designed to, quote, educate children about class conflict, an attempt that proved to be largely unsuccessful, since younger audiences tended to ignore the, quote, history lesson and get lost in the fantasy of reductionist and jejune adventure plotlines. Red Westerns, which are post-war East German cultural products made in reaction to Karl May novels turned TV miniseries in 1950s West Germany, as well as American Westerns, they are hardly more accurate depictions of Native American history than Hollywood studio productions. In May's novels and DEFA productions, the history of Native Americans is product of European anxieties and used as propaganda to serve European agendas. And though Red Westerns were billed by producers as more ethnographically, anthropologically, and historically accurate than their American counterpart, they were, as this project demonstrates, part of the same culture industry that pervaded fascist Germany and post-war America. And so, despite the ideological inversion of American Westerns, Red Westerns helped construct capitalist subjects in the decades prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Red Westerns are indeed a discursive site where meanings of national and cultural identity were negotiated and contested, paradoxically staged both as escapes from and confirmations of state-prescribed national identities, a battleground not only between whites and reds, but also between state ideology, studio fantasy production, and spectatorial identification. The Sons of Great Mother Bear, for instance, concludes with a tribal leader resettling his people on fertile soil, where he declares, "Farming, raising domesticated buffaloes, being blacksmiths, and making plows, that is our new path." And for a Volk only a half-decade removed from being walled in, consuming stories of nomadic tribes must have been an incredibly powerful fantasy consumed through Red Westerns. It is indeed striking, Germunten argues, how many of the films conclude with the tribe moving to a better hunting ground, the ultimate fantasy of the citizens of the GDR. Red Westerns thus exhibit a post-war cultural anxiety prevalent behind the Iron Curtain. At the turn of the 20th century, at the same historical moment when Wild Bill's Wild West show toured Europe to raucous audiences and rave reviews, Karl May was the most read writer of the German language. But he was officially debased in the German Democratic Republic during the Cold War as a bourgeois chauvinist and the, quote, cowboy mentor of the Führer, whose exotic tales paved the way for the fascist ideology of blood and soil that reached its zenith in the 1930s and 1940s. But Red Westerns, though they were made in reaction to May's novel series Winnetou, which Hitler supposedly ordered his generals to read after the debacle at Stalingrad in order to boost their morale, were all part of the same semantic field that depicted Native Americans as noble savage caricatures popularized throughout the Enlightenment. And though Red Westerns were made in reaction to Karl May, and despite the brick wall separating East Germany from the West, both cultures shared generations of history that could not be erased, undone, or separated by the Cold War. Adorno and Horkheimer theorized that myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to mythology. Red Westerns help illuminate the point. Native Americans, Christian Feast argues in Indians in Europe, an interdisciplinary collection of essays, constitute a wholly fictional population inhabiting the Old World mind rather than New World lands. To Europeans, Indians had always served as a message of one kind or another. The message could simultaneously remind Europeans of the glory of their achievements, their fall from grace, and their alienation from nature. Raina Green's The Tribe Called Wannabe, playing Indian in America and Europe, like Vine Deloria's Playing Indian, asserts that in some instances Indians have been synonymous with nature, progress, and American identity, sometimes simultaneously. The theory of progress in the arts is bound up with the idea of the imitation of nature, Walter Benjamin writes in the Arcades Project, and must be discussed in the context of this idea. And that's exactly what sociologist Robert Burkhofer Jr.'s The White Man's Indian from Columbus to Present does. Berkhofer examines how imagery of Native Americans in literature, art, and philosophy from first contact to the 1970s served to, as Edward Said would surmise, orientalize Indians in North America, much in the same manner the British orientalized actual Indians in Asia during the 19th century. European literature, art, and philosophy, according to Berkhofer, was a discourse of domination that helped Europeans objectify and rationalize amoral land grabs and genocide in the 400 years prior to the Trail of Broken Treaties. Europeans in North America, according to Green and Deloria, traditionally masqueraded as Indians in order to distance themselves from identification as European. These initial shapes of playing Indian, according to Green and Deloria, constituted cultural origins of America in which Europeans were transformed by Indians and Indians were transformed by Europeans into the, quote, new man St. John de Crèvecoeur hailed. Deloria argues that the reason white men dressed as Indians in order to throw the King of England's tea into the Boston Harbor was to declare themselves distinctly American, thus making a conscious break with European imperialism. But if playing Indian is synonymous with New Worlders defining themselves as modern in contrast to the Old World, and later as a rationalization for transcontinental colonization of American Indians, why would Europeans in the 20th century, particularly Germans in the post-war period, who never colonized North America, so keenly play Indian in the post-war period? Well, for starters, Karl Marx was fascinated by American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan's writings on the Iroquois. Morgan lived among the Iroquois and played them in the course of his research in the middle of the 19th century. And though there's no evidence of Marx himself playing Indian, he saw in the Iroquois past a model for how humanity could and should be organized, particularly the eradication of private property. David Bathrick argues in The Powers of Speech, The Politics of Culture in the GDR, that Red Westerns are evidence of East Germans appropriating American Indian culture as nostalgia desperately needed after the horrors of fascism and 2 world wars, all of which happened in the span of a quarter century. The theory of progress thus became bound up with notions of pre-capitalism, as Anglo-Saxons in North America had, according to Green and Deloria, played both nature and American by playing Indian. Red Westerns make evident that the ascendant industrial age of the 19th and 20th centuries gradually reconfigured the function of playing Indian, so that by the Cold War, it became a means of playing the opposite of American. In Gunfighter Nation, The Myth of the Frontier in 20th Century America, Richard Slotkin argues that by the time Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his frontier thesis at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, that Americans were not as invested in playing Indian in order to stylize and define themselves as distinctly non-European as they had been in previous centuries. After a half-century of colonialism and genocide of Native Americans underwritten by the U.S. government, white men such as Theodore Roosevelt had, by 1898, begun self-consciously stylizing themselves as individualistic cowboys at odds with communards such as Indians. The conflation between capitalism and individualism iconographically embodied in the American cowboy was fueled by the invention and popularization of fin de siècle cinema and consumerism, as evinced by Edwin Porter's wildly popular The Great Train Robbery. In short, movies made America a cowboy nation so distinctly, profoundly, and pervasively that as early as 1924, Soviets were mocking Americans by spoofing Westerns. The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks is considered the first Soviet film that is overtly anti-American. The film parodies Americans as ignorant and buffoonishly leery about the Russian Revolution. Mr. West, the president of the YMCA, travels to Moscow with a cowboy named Jetty, who he thinks can protect him from savage Bolsheviks he's read about in American magazines. Jetty, however, is unable to keep West from being kidnapped by a Russian count and his gang of marauders. Genuine Bolsheviks finally liberate West from the imperialists, and the film concludes with West indulging in a sightseeing tour of Moscow, where he's relieved to find that the Bolsheviks have preserved positive aspects of the ancient regime, such as the University of Moscow and Bolshoi Theater. The last scene of the film depicts proud and honorable Bolsheviks marching through Moscow in unison, which inspires West to embrace communism so devoutly that he beseeches his wife to hang a portrait of Russian Premier Vladimir Lenin on the wall of their home. Lemonade Joe is also a progenitor of red westerns. The 1964 Czechoslovakian satire, made in the spirit of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, parodies big business's pervasiveness in post-war American politics. Joe, the protagonist, is a clean-living gunfighter who is often depicted drinking Cola Loca, which is an obvious homage to Coca-Cola. Joe's character is a hero of capitalism and a shameless corporate shill. And by the end of the film, he convinces foes terrorizing the town to abandon their villainous ways for the sake of making the town safe for economic development. His love interest is split between a raven-haired whorehouse proprietor and a fair-haired evangelical girl, and Joe ultimately falls for the latter, since her temperance campaign is good for Cola Loca's business. From the time the curtain fell on World War II in 1945, to the time the Iron Curtain was erected in 1960, cultural elites in both the US and Soviet empires were not merely defining themselves in contrast to the other through popular cinematic productions. They were refining techniques of social control via mass media. In other words, red westerns are evidence that Soviets are playing Indian in the Cold War as a means of stylizing themselves as antipodal to American westerns as metaphor for rugged individualism, American capitalism embodied in Theodore Roosevelt and John Wayne. But the very act of consuming red westerns helped cultural elites craft political and marketized subjects in much the same manner as had happened in fascist Germany and post-war America, through the production and distribution of mass media designed to manufacture consent. Red westerns were incredibly popular in Eastern Bloc countries in the 1960s and 70s, and by then Raina Green argues Native American culture was increasingly fetishized throughout the world as a model of a alternative lifestyle that was manifested in communal living and fashion. And following broad trends toward environmentalism and anti-technology, North American Indians were symbolized as inherently possessing pre-capitalist social and economic values, and thus were the antithesis of Western imperialism, or at least that's how they were commodified. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, from hippies in San Francisco to factory workers in Frankfurt, American Indians were increasingly fetishized as soulful, wise, ritualistic, and at times supernatural noble savages, victimized rather than participants in Enlightenment-era imperialism. In Gunfighter Nation, Slotkin argues that The Magnificent Seven, a remake of Japanese director Akira Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai, was a counterinsurgent film that celebrated guerrilla warfare against imperial power, and thus foreshadowed America in Vietnam. The Vietnamese were, not ironically, metaphorically conflated with American Indians. As the number of U.S. troops deployed to Vietnam increased in the 1960s, the use of Indian metaphors to describe the people, the place, and the process in Vietnam became more common and more public. U.S. military officials often describe Viet Cong-controlled territory as, quote, Indian country. The ascendant popularity of red westerns behind the Iron Curtain in the 1960s can be traced to the 1960 Moscow Film Festival premiere of The Magnificent Seven. Soviet leaders had previously been reticent about exposing subjects to American films, but the film was so apparently subversive of post-war Western imperialism that officials permitted it to be viewed.
Seven, the Magnificent Seven. They were only seven, but they fought like 700 to bring the kind of justice that would last. They made a brave stand, the Magnificent Seven. They fought for the future to wipe away their past.
Both The Magnificent Seven and red westerns are part of a genre known as revisionist westerns, which was a post-war global phenomenon that gained increased notoriety and popularity during the Vietnam War. Revisionist westerns include spaghetti westerns from Italy and Zapata westerns, which were set in Mexico during the decade-long revolution. Revisionist westerns were often replete with anti-heroes, lawlessness, intended to critique big business as greedy and corrupt. They also inverted common tropes in traditional American westerns by providing more sympathetic, or at least complex, portrayals of Native Americans, African Americans, and women. The genre was conspicuously used as political fodder behind the Iron Curtain. After the premiere of Little Big Man at the 1971 Moscow Film Festival, a bravado reviewer described the massacre of Cheyenne by U.S. Army troops as, quote, "what the American Army is doing in our time in Indochina." Red Westerns were, in short, product of a global, anti-imperial, post-colonial, post-war ethos manifest in pop culture on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But for all the billing as antithesis to Hollywood studio productions, Red Westerns were ultimately designed to project a pervasively conservative hegemonic discourse that was, like its American counterpart, rooted in Enlightenment-era economics, politics, and philosophy. Like Hollywood Westerns, Red Westerns celebrated the same racism and heteronormativity pervasive throughout Enlightenment-era Western empires. Gojko Mitic, a bodybuilder born in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, is considered the John Wayne of Red Westerns. He played Indian chief in numerous DEFRA productions, as well as Winnetou in the Karl May Festival, and on television in 1992, soon after German reunification. So despite the inversion of capitalist rhetoric and sympathetic portrayal of Native Americans, Mitic, much like Al Jolson in blackface minstrel performances a generation earlier, characterized and thus debased an entire race of human beings. As with most Hollywood westerns, Red Westerns largely conflated tribal difference into a generic mascot-like ahistorical caricature and thus ignored centuries of regional and cultural difference. An autonomous Native American past prior to 1740 does not actually exist in Red Westerns, thus making them hardly more historical than Hollywood Westerns. DEFA depictions of Native Americans, thus, like their American counterparts, provide viewers with the same hokey and tired cliches and misconceptions of tribal life exhibited in Hollywood Westerns, such as steely-eyed warriors with blank stares who are so adept at horseback riding that they seem like centaurs of the plains. Indians in Red Westerns speak in short, choppy sentences, and the primary focus of each film is always on the power of white imperialists to limit the agency of Native Americans. Red Westerns also perpetuate the same gender norms popularized in mass media throughout Western empires during the Enlightenment. Indian women, if depicted at all, are sacrificial lambs to plotlines that perpetuate fantasies of coital bliss and revenge. Heteronormativity is particularly prevalent in Chingachgook. Wadawa, the daughter of a Delawarean chief, is promised to Chingachgook, a virile warrior. But before the marriage, Huron raiders sack the Delawarean camp and kidnap the Indian princess. Chingachgook, together with his kindly white friend, Deerslayer, eventually free Wadawa from her captors. Chingachgook is thus an inversion of the damsel in distress narrative perpetuated in numerous Hollywood westerns. But rather than whites having to free a helpless white woman from Indians, white imperialists have corrupted Indian tribes, as if Indians lived harmoniously before whites arrived in North America, which is not entirely accurate. And Red Westerns thus invert tropes and themes common to American westerns, but cannot escape the deep-seated racism and sexism part and parcel of the western genre, which, of course, grew out of generations of Enlightenment-era discourse, art, philosophy, and politics. Red Westerns are also deeply implicated in the post-war culture industry due to the way they, like Hollywood movies, create and perpetuate consumer star culture, which is inherently class-based. A case in point is Mitic. By refusing to be a powerless victim of genocide, Mitic's portrayals of Tecumseh, Osceola, Otsana, Toki Ito, Chingachgook, Harterfelsen, and Severino act out the fantasy of the resistance fighter and the anti-fascist, providing a role model for young children and relieving the older ones from responsibilities they may not have been up to during the 1930s and 1940s. The cult of stardom, red class hierarchy, inherent to and embedded in the film industry in the U.S., as well as East and West Germany, and in pop art writ large throughout the post-war world, serves ideological and advertising interests Benjamin discusses in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. The fantasies commodified through Mitzich's heroic persona accentuate responsibility for the community, fairness, and willingness to reach peaceful agreements with an enemy one knows to be economically and militaristically superior. And since his characters were physically fit and rejected firewater, Mittich could be unabashedly celebrated as a role model for children, the dream of teenage girls, and ideal son-in-law and model citizen. And when Gotchko was on the scene, one reporter noted, "We had mass rallies that weren't even ordered from above." Mittich's star persona as the antithesis of John Wayne could at once stand in for the Yugoslav partisan, the model German, the displaced Jew, as well as American Indian. And yet, the fantasies perpetuated in Red Westerns are equally utopian to manifest destiny ideology of individualism and capitalist expansion espoused in Hollywood Westerns. In short, Mittich was a kind of Che Guevara t-shirt. Despite his commodified form as anti-capitalist, his very commodification is an example of how consumer culture co-opts symbols of rebellion in order to serve particular agendas and economic means and ends. The distribution of these means and ends is the basis of partisan politics. Perhaps the most glaring irony of Red Westerns is that although they celebrate an ideology of communalism embodied in Native Americans, the act of consuming the genre was intensely personally gratifying for viewers and thus crafted the desire to more actively participate in the culture industry. The star cult Mittich was embedded in behind the Iron Curtain is eerily similar to the demagoguery in fascist Germany and post-war America, and serves as evidence that consumer culture was increasingly desirable behind the Iron Curtain decades prior to the disintegration of the Berlin Wall. In short, the very act of consuming Red Westerns is evidence that viewers were not merely being shaped as nationalist or political subjects, they were also being conditioned as capitalist subjects. The post-war industrialization of pop culture and mass media, such as film production, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, is reflected in viewer psychic structure. Cinema, like steam and rail travel in the 19th century, made previously disconnected regions of the world, including Latin America, Asia, and Europe, more easily and expediently absorbed into metropoles in Europe and North America, thus expanding the realm and range of consumer capitalism. Wolfgang Schivelbusch's The Railway Journey, the industrialization and perception of time and space, and Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction find the correlation between industrialized consciousness and consumer consciousness. Adorno, Horkheimer, Schivelbusch, and Benjamin's works were all informed by Marx's notion that production not only provides an object for the subject, but also provides a subject for the object, and their correlation helps to elaborate the point that viewers of Red Westerns, regardless of the ideological rhetoric presented in the medium, were pervasively developing an industrialized consciousness, and thus being disciplined as capitalist subjects through the very act of consuming an incredibly powerful communication technology and consumer good, cinema, in this case, Red Westerns. American Westerns and Red Westerns are part of the same semantic field. Both are products of European empires that sought to define themselves in contrast to the other as the true preservers and arbiters of Enlightenment-era values in the 20th century. Red Westerns were thus not the antithesis of Hollywood Westerns that glorified capitalism. They were subjects to Hollywood Westerns. Although they seem on the surface to be antipodal Hollywood Westerns, they are, from a marketing and consumer standpoint, hardly more different than Coke is to Pepsi. The political ideology rhetorically espoused, whether materialist or laissez-faire capitalism, is beside the point. The act of consumption, the fantasy, that's the basis of reality in post-war East and West Germany. And who, after the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, the austerity and hunger of the Depression, and the fear of fascism, as well as the horror of 2 world wars, could fault the logic?